This week's learning module is a very important one, a very complex one, and it has to do with color grading or color correction in Avid Media Composer.
Welcome. I'm certainly glad you could join me today. I thought today we'd just do a fantastic little painting that I think you'll really enjoy.
So what we're dealing with now is the notion of color correction or color grading, and that's kind of changed in the last few years since we went pretty much all digital media 10 years ago or so. The notion of color correction, which meant there was something wrong with your footage, shot with a camera on tape, that evolved into color grading, meaning to enhance the footage, maybe give it a tone. A lot of modern day television shows and movies have a certain tone to it, bluish, yellowish, hyper-real color. I'm sure you've noticed that. And that's done almost always through the post-production process, and usually through a specific color grading artist or color grading application, although the color grader in Avid is actually pretty good. Okay, so over here I've put together a timeline of clips that we can use. Now this is from a little featurette I downloaded on the behind the scenes of Game of Thrones. And over here again, our workspace is the edit workspace where we do the source record editing. Then the color effects, audio, we dealt with audio, so we're going to go to color. And you can see how everything changes. And here's the classic color wheel displayed that many of you probably think of when you see a color correction, color grading program. And we'll use this a little bit, but really we're going to do a different method. And again, I'm giving you a workflow that I think is good for beginners, and certainly there's a million different ways to do things in Avid, and you're going to have to pick your own. But for now, let's follow this workflow. So we see the whole space has changed. Here we're seeing the color wheels, and unfortunately they don't make this too bright, but they represent the color of the shadows of an image, the midtones of an image, and the highlights of an image. And we'll get into that a little more. Now, the way the display is set up, if you look up here, we have current shot, the shot we're sitting on in the timeline, the previous shot, and the next shot. Okay, so the idea here is that if you're trying to color grade shots in a sequence and you want to make sure they look like one another, they match one another, or whatever, this way you can have a visual reference. However, there are also other things you can do, and this first lesson will deal with the kind of setting up and understanding how everything is working. So for that, we're going to switch this next view to a video scope. And I'm going to click here, and you can see, and then you could change these, by the way. But here, there's these various video scopes. Scopes are things that measure the digital electronic value. If I click quad display, let me move over a little bit. Here you can see 4 different scopes at once. And now, maybe in RTVF 44 or other places, you would go into depth in what these are. This is called a waveform, and this shows the visual value, the electronic value. If I go to that directly, so you can see quad display, that's a waveform. I'm going to go to that directly. Notice what happens as I kind of scan through. You see a change, and there's that guy in the orange shirt, and you kind of can see him represented walking through, so those peaks and valleys represent him. And this thing that's called a Y waveform only measures the luminance, doesn't take into account the color. It has another one called YC waveform, which shows the color values as well. Okay, so the waveform measures the visual digital output. Now I'm going to go back to the regular waveform, and just to show you. And so how is this measured? Well, in all the scopes, practically all the scopes, there is this scale, and you can see here it's 0 and up, 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 and to 100. And that's because you really should keep the value, the intensity within that parameter, 0 to 100. In the olden days, the analog days, that was very strict. I remember doing television shows with different channels, and they would have a standards committee look at the delivered show, and if the digital value went above or below, it was rejected, and you had to go back and fix it. So what do I mean by that? There are kind of two different basic workflow windows. One is called HSL, stands for hue, saturation, luminance. Hue being the tint of the color, saturation being the amount of the color, and luminance being the intensity of the light. Okay? And so that gives you these different color wheels, which are really used for adjusting the tint, the hue of the color more than anything else, but also the intensity. So let's say here the midtones, which are kind of like, flesh and things that are not too bright, not too dark. If I were to move the midtone color wheel, here it's in the center, meaning it's kind of like the 0 dB of audio. This is exactly what you're giving it. If I were to move it forward towards the red, you could see how the image becomes more red. If I move it down towards the blue area, it becomes more blue. And if we look at the wheel itself, you can see this is kind of standard. We have red, green, and blue over here, even though it says E, don't really know why it does that. And then in between yellow, cyan, and magenta. And so you can see with this, you can adjust maybe just the shadows to go more green, and the midtones to go more red, and the highlights, let's send them to yellow. So you can play around with the image if you like, and there are many different ways to do that. And to bring this back, to normal, on any of these parameters, you can option click the option key. Here, there it goes back, and here it goes back. So clicking the option key is the way to reset any parameter you change, and you'll probably be wanting to do that quite a bit. Also here you can see there's an overall gain. How much intensity do we have? And I could raise that right there. The default is set to 100. The gain default is set to 100. And if I grab that fader and bring it up, you can see on that scope and on the picture how it gets more intense. And then gamma is similar to the midtone ranges, this area in here. And as I change that, you see the middle part kind of shift up and down. And setup refers to the bottom layer, the darkness. And as I move that down, picture gets much darker, all the way down to pretty much 0, and then going up, 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 brightening it all the way. Just again to take a look at how the scope is measured, let's take our gain and bring it up and watch what happens over here. So this lump represents probably this cloud because it's the brightest part of the picture. And so I'm going to bring that up. And you can see I bring it up to 100. And when I go past 100, in the preferences of this scope, you can see all of a sudden it goes white, meaning, hey, pal, you're beyond the limit that we would like. And as I move it up further, you'll see it flattens out. And whenever you see anything flatten out, that's not really a good sign, because what that means is you now lost all detail. So if we look in the brightest parts of the cloud, we'll see it went just to pure white. Once you lose that detail and say you export it, there's no way to get that back. So if I bring it back down, let's watch the cloud here, see how it changes. And if I go up, and now I'm going to go down, you notice how detail comes back into the cloud. Gee, it's not really just a white blob. It has all sorts of nuance to it. And notice where the scope is, it is below 100. So that's the reason for this. Nowadays, doing everything online and all the digital devices we use are much more forgiving. This is not quite as restrictive as it used to be, but you can see if you're popping something up, oh, that looks great over here. Yeah, but what's happening over here? Do you not care about the cloud? Fine. But if you do, there's an issue. And if we're going to go to the darkest part, which is the setup, over here, this bottom area, which should be at 0, I am going to bring it down. And again, you see it kind of goes into that range where it looks white and kind of saying, gee, it's pretty dark. But again, this is just that little bit. This probably represents this. Let's see what happens if I move it. Yeah, see, it follows. That's following him. You can see him going through, and that represents probably the darkest part of the picture. So that's not too bad, and as we raise it, again, notice what happens on the other end. So, it's a give and take of everything to have it the same. And how do I do this? Gee, I got it. Option. And if I don't click option, by the way, this will show, preview what it is with the adjustment and what it is without the adjustment, just so you know. It's a way you can kind of judge what you're doing. But I'm going to option click it and get it back to normal. So those are some of the controls.